So I've been playing Borderlands games since the launch of Borderlands 1, and having been playing all of those games for all of these years, one of the things I have learned is that for a majority of the Borderlands games, especially on launch, they have not had enough endgame content. This includes all of the games. None of the games have really had that robust of an endgame. We've definitely had some good endgame systems that have given a lot of playtime, but in most of those games, the future DLCs or the future updates or the takedowns is the additions that is usually added the really replayable endgame. And that is something that I'm hoping Borderlands 4 has much more of on launch of the game. Because if Borderlands 4 actually has a much more robust and interesting endgame, not only does that make the launch of the game just generally much better, but that also allows them to maybe experiment more with future updates and DLCs. Because I also think it's a pretty good chance that Borderlands 4 is going to be somewhat a live service game in a similar way to Borderlands 3 was. It was teetering on being a live service. Obviously, it has all the paid DLCs, but then we also got a bunch of free updates like the takedowns, which is also some of the most interesting endgame content I think that's ever been added to a Borderlands game. So I just want to go over some of the endgame systems I would love to see in the endgame of Borderlands 4. And this isn't going to be a list or anything in particular order, but starting off, I do want something from Borderlands 3, the takedowns, or more specifically, the first takedown, which was the really good one in Borderlands 3. Now, if you never played Borderlands 3 or you didn't play these takedowns, they were free content updates that were essentially Borderlands implementation of raids. Now, you could still do them solo. They were pretty crazy. They had ridiculous amounts of enemies. They were actually really difficult even with some of the best builds at the time, and you would end up going through all of these different sections and you would be facing multiple different bosses throughout the entirety of it. The last boss of the first takedown was essentially the first raid boss of Borderlands 3, and I think having at least one of these takedowns on the launch of Borderlands 4 would just make the endgame significantly better, because these takedowns were very well made, at least the first one. The second one had way too many weird mechanics and invulnerability phases with the end boss, so a lot of it just didn't end up being fun, but the first one is what they should really be looking at to make another takedown for Borderlands 4. Crazy high density, pretty good loot, multiple interesting boss fights where you really didn't have like a bunch of blocks or a bunch of points where the boss would go immune to damage. You could essentially brute force all of the bosses throughout the takedown. I know there were some immunities, but it wasn't super excessive like a lot of other bosses in Borderlands 3 could be, and I think that mix of things just brings out some of the best elements in Borderlands, and not only allows you to kind of switch up your builds for something different, because the density was ridiculous in there. It was higher than a lot of other areas in the game, and then you had these pretty hard bosses, so you could really kind of tailor your build to trying to do that takedown, and it felt pretty varied because there was just a bunch of different sections you went through that definitely gave you a bunch of different varied gameplay. So if there was one thing I really wanted to see in the endgame of Borderlands 4, it would definitely be having a takedown. Now, this next thing isn't a new specific system or piece of content, but this is generally how I want the bosses or boss farming in Borderlands 4 to go. First off, it is going to be a seamless open world, so I hope there is a new way to reset bosses. If I would have to guess, you will probably just be able to go back to the main menu and load back in, which is the worst way. I definitely don't want that. And that just loads you back in as close as it possibly could to the boss, closest respawn station, or you'll have to leave that boss area and go a certain distance away for that boss to respawn in. Personally, I want some ability to just reset bosses in their arena, or maybe have like a gate for all arenas or something like that, or maybe you could put it on the closest respawn station and just have like a button that resets the bosses or resets the closest boss or something like that. Just like a button somewhere, or even something in a menu that you can just click to respawn the boss if you're not in its arena. Just something that allows you to kind of do it more quickly, that doesn't require you go back to the main menu, it doesn't require you potentially go super far away from the boss arena. Just something that's a bit more simple that just allows us to farm in the way we want. That's always been a thing in every Borderlands game, just being able to go back and constantly reform the same boss, and just removing any of the friction of that to be able to just constantly defeat and farm that boss, I think is generally just going to make it better. And on top of that, I want targeted loot farming. So I do think it's still good for pretty much every weapon or most of the weapons to still be in the general loot pool, but I want to be able to go to a specific boss and knows it'll drop these specific items much more than any other boss. So I know I can go to that boss to target farm those specific items I'm looking for. Because not having the ability to target farm a majority or all of the more rare items in the game just makes them feel kind of impossible to obtain. And not only does it just feel like they kind of become impossible to obtain in normal gameplay, but it forces everybody to go to the most cracked farm locations, even if those locations aren't really fun, even if you don't like the farm there. And it just becomes super boring to farm the same location of like specific enemies or higher density locations to try to get the loot you're going for, instead of just being able to constantly vary up your farm and go to a new boss or go to a new area. It just allows a lot more variation in the gameplay you're doing to farm what you're actually looking for. And this next thing could have been tied into the last thing I went over with all the boss farming, but on the launch of Borderlands 4, I want raid bosses, or I guess more specifically, invincible bosses. Those are something that we're sorely missing on the launch of Borderlands. Those have always been a pretty big staple of the Borderlands franchise. Just these massive endgame bosses you can go to. They have a massive arena. They're the hardest bosses in the game, or supposed to be the hardest bosses in the game. They give you the biggest loot explosions, and you're just able to go farm these end game super hard bosses. And not only do I just want one raid boss or one invincible boss, I want at least a handful of them, and I want them to all actually be very difficult. Because even if they had a bunch of these raid bosses or invincible bosses, if they just made them super easy even for kind of mid builds, then they really wouldn't feel like that, even though they're named something the invincible. I want them to actually be really difficult. They could have some type of payment. Like we've seen a bunch of raid bosses in the past where you have to spend some type of currency to go to them. They could have a mix of some of them requiring a payment and maybe they give more loot, or maybe all of them could be defeated freely at any time and maybe they either give a lot less loot, or I think probably the best way to do it is there's no payment on entering the boss arena and fighting the boss, and you still get some amount of loot explosion. But if you want the big loot explosions after you defeat the boss, maybe there's something you go put currency into and you can just spew out a bunch of additional loot that would still follow that boss's loot table. So it allows you to still get some loot, still fight those bosses for free, but if you have the currency, you can really juice up how much loot you're getting. That would just allow people to farm them much more. It would allow people to maybe build up their currency for a specific boss they want to go farm more, and instead of spending it on this boss they want to go fight some, they can just fight the boss, not spend the currency at the end, and maybe save that for something else. So this just allows players to have more options how they're getting loot and what bosses they're actually fighting, because the fighting of the boss is the content, but then you can just add the ability to spend more currency to get more loot, because I think allowing the players to get to the content when they want to do it is generally just going to be better. And even though this video is generally more focused on endgame content, things you would be doing when you're done with the campaign, when you're done with the main quest, and things you would be doing more so at max level, there is a few things that will still make the endgame much better. One of them being cutscene skips and skipping dialogue and all that type of stuff when going through the questing again. Even if I don't like the story or I don't think the story is good, I'll still follow the story and watch all the cutscenes in my first playthrough at least. But after your first playthrough, a lot of people just want to choose if they want to follow the story again or if they want to skip everything as quickly as possible. Not only that, but I do hope there is a skip for other characters like they implemented into Borderlands 3 later in its life, where after you get one character through the main quest and you get it to max level, you're able to just bring other vault hunters up to that max level and basically just skip all the main quest lines. That just allows for so much cool end game gameplay, and I think just keeps players from being burnt out, because if you can just get one character to the end game, do all of the questing and campaign stuff on that one character, do it all once, and then you can just bring up other vault hunters to that level whenever you want to start gearing them and start trying out new builds. It just gives players so much more to do with the same exact amount of content, because so many players won't touch other vault hunters because they don't want to go through the campaigns again. They don't want to go through that kind of slog of leveling up. But if you just have a character, the you could start at max level, then people can instantly start to try out builds and just get to the kind of fun of the end game, which is farming all the bosses, trying to farm up the loot, and try to make cool and new interesting builds. So even though this is something that isn't specifically tied to the end game, these features will really help the end game and the longevity of Borderlands 4. And I think the final thing I wanted to mention in this video is more rarities. Just having the uncommon, the common, the rare, epic, and the legendary, just having those kind of basic colors, those basic elements that we had in Borderlands 3, I don't think is enough. Pretty much everybody wants at least another rarity above legendary, something like pearlescent. I also even hope that the unique weapons, so the weapons with red text on them that are usually something very unique that a lot of times are obtained from quests, I hope those have a separate color too, because you go back to previous Borderlands games, or specifically Borderlands 3, most of those or all of those were just blue rarity. So even if you got this unique weapon with red text on it, if you're not an experienced player, you may not know that those items could be incredibly strong or incredibly unique and maybe items you want to keep. A lot of people just see, oh, I got a blue from this quest, I can just salvage it or mark it as trash and keep using the legendary items I may have. So I think having a different color for specifically those unique items with the unique red text on them would actually be better. Not only would it just be better for actual player usability and readability, it could be really cool just as another rarity, and you could also add some more endgame items because it has its own rarity. You could maybe just add in some of those in kind of other areas of the game. You could even add like secrets or Easter eggs that have those items as well, and players would always know, oh, this is a unique item. This is something pretty special compared to maybe some of the other rarities of weapons. But then on top of that, which is something I was mentioning, we should at least have pearlescent above legendary. And pearlescent should not be terrible. A lot of the pearlescents from previous Borderlands games ended up being just bad. Just legendaries were better most of the time. I want a rarity above legendary that are pearlescent, that are generally just better than legendaries. Even if that causes a bit more power scaling and maybe makes things a bit easier when you get them, pearlescent should be incredibly rare, but they should always feel incredible when you get one. Even if you have to make them a bit overpowered at the start and maybe tone them down a little bit later on, just make sure they're always really strong. If you get that pearlescent to drop, you should be able to equip that, and no matter what build you're on, it should be somewhat usable in the end game. It should be stronger than a lot of the legendary items. Don't have any other like variables on it, like how we had anointed in Borderlands 3, and we're gonna have some other type of thing like that in Borderlands 4. Hopefully pearlescents are just pearlescents. It's almost like getting a unique item from an ARPG like Diablo or Path of Exile. It's that unique item. That item is how it is when you get it. Obviously it would have some different parts and stuff on it because it's in Borderlands. It doesn't have any other like super special augments or anything like that you can get on it. That unique item is kind of that unique item, and that would just be pearlescence for Borderlands 4. But that's some of the main endgame systems and content I want to see in the launch of Borderlands 4. So thanks for watching.